Judges, is Donald Trump a dictator? Well, he may certainly look like one as he deploys National Guard troops onto the streets of three American cities. That's why today's question is so deeply important. The question is, what are the impacts of the Supreme Court's rulings on regarding National Guard deployments? To answer this question, we'll focus on 3 points. First, we'll talk about the background of these National Guard deployments. Second, we'll talk about Trump's constitutional authority to deploy the National Guard. And third, we'll talk about whether or not Donald Trump is truly a dictator. Well, if you haven't heard, Donald Trump has in fact deployed the National Guard to the streets of several cities. This is reported by The Hill on October 29, 2025, saying that Donald Trump deployed the National Guard to Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. The reasoning for this that Donald Trump gave is that the president does have authority under certain statutes, says The Hill, to deploy National Guard troops if he's unable to otherwise execute the laws of the United States. However, this was blocked by other courts. On October 23, 2025, Reuters reported that several states who had those, California and Oregon, who had those National Guard deployed onto their streets, sued the Trump administration. The judge of the lower court who ruled on the states who sued Donald Trump blocked Trump from deploying the National Guard, saying that there was, quote, no rebellion, unquote, and therefore it was unnecessary for Donald Trump to use National Guard troops. And deploying the military to city streets is certainly a major act. It does, in fact, make Trump look like a dictator, because that's something dictators do. As NPR reports on December 31, 2025, with one of the experts they interviewed on the subject in this article, said that one thing that has set America apart as a nation is that it refuses to let the military be deployed to American streets. However, this obviously isn't a completely illegal. Trump is not wading into completely illegal waters here. Although it's a dramatic action, it's not without just it need not be without just cause, and he may have power to do so, as we'll see in the second point by analyzing what the Constitution actually says about this, because this is the true answer to this will help us reveal whether or not Donald Trump is truly a dictator. The Constitution forms the basis of Donald Trump's authority. If he disobeys it, then he is outside the law, whereas if he obeys it, he is within the law, even if his actions look dramatic. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says that the president shall be vested with executive power. Executive as in execute, or basically do. Donald Trump, or any president of the United States, is given the power to execute the laws of the United States, obviously within certain bounds, and with using certain means. It would be silly for Donald Trump to use illegal immigration enforcement to put out fires on houses, because that's not one of the president's duties, and he does not have the legal ability to do so. However, he is supposed to enforce the law. And Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution says that the president may command state militias when those militias are called into the service of the United States. As The Hill established in the article we referenced earlier, there are statutes allowing the president to call up National Guard forces if he is unable to otherwise enforce the law. So if Donald Trump is unable to enforce the federal law in these cities, specifically on illegal immigration, that's what this whole issue is about, then he is justified in bringing the National Guard into those cities to enforce the law. But he may have other motives. Maybe he doesn't just want to enforce law on illegal immigration. Maybe he wants to exert power and influence over America. Is Trump truly a dictator? Well, we'll talk about this in the third point. Is Trump a dictator? So, to analyze that, let's bring in some of the greatest minds of Western civilization, possibly the founding mind of the American form of government, John Locke, who wrote the Second Treatise on Government, a book that foundationally influenced the thought of the American founders. John Locke wrote that, quote, "Wherever law ends, tyranny begins," unquote. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. So if Donald Trump stays within the law, he is not being tyrannical. The moment he begins to disobey the law, that's when he becomes a tyrant, a dictator. John Locke said that force should only be used, and this applies to the president, to oppose, quote, "unjust and unlawful force." Therefore, if there are unjust and unlawful forces opposing the U.S. federal government and enforcing the law, then Donald Trump does have justification to call up the National Guard. But if there is not unlawful force, Donald Trump does not have that authority. So, we can see that John Locke says that the president must operate within the laws. Ben Shapiro, a political commentator, in a video essay on January 17, 2026, advocated Trump's ability to follow the law. It's the number one reason he is not a dictator. Ben Shapiro pointed out that Donald Trump does follow the laws. And this is the crucial point that we will end this speech on. Donald Trump does follow the laws. As The Hill reported in this article we referenced earlier, the lower courts blocked this ruling. And as Reuters reported, also in the article we referenced earlier, Donald Trump followed that ruling. So, as this issue goes up to the Supreme Court, whether or not the Supreme Court rules in Donald Trump's favor, Donald Trump does obey the law. This means that the American system of government is still working. We aren't a dictatorship. We're a democracy.